Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Masters of TESOL. Before we get into the show, think about this.
Students don't learn what we teach, they learn what they think about.
That is Professor Stephen Van Vlack, who is currently an assistant professor of applied linguistics at the Graduate School of TESOL, Sungmyung Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. And what we're going to be talking about today, well, it takes some nailing down.
The best way of framing this, or the term that you could apply to this, would be brain-based sort of approaches to education, or in our case, sort of language education, or second language, or subsequent, additional, all the different terms. I think stick with one, additional language learning.
Okay.
So brain-based approaches to additional language learning.
Okay, you got that? Great. So today we're looking at the actual processes of how students learn, what actually goes on in the brain. Now, this is not an easy subject, but it's definitely worth knowing if you want to know how to teach in the most effective way. Because of the complexity of this subject, this is a much slimmed down, more teaching-focused version of the interview that we had. If you want to hear another 15 minutes or so of kind of theories about how the brain actually processes information and how we perceive the world, then go to mastersoftesol.com and you can play the rest from the website. And cards on the table, there was some recording problems when we did this interview, so you will notice changes in the sound quality, but still, just focus on the information, you'll be fine. So strap in and get ready for brain-based approaches to additional language learning.
And as the name would imply, what you're looking at is you're using sort of recent findings in neurology and neuroscience to try to enhance our understanding of how these kind of systems work within the brain, and how these systems then integrate and in particular lead towards better learning for language.
Okay. For a beginner, how would you explain those basic points?
Yeah, so the basic background, I guess it all kind of falls back on neuroscience, which is basically the study of the brain and the neurology of the brain, the structure of the brain, and how the different structures of the brain actually work, how the systems that we know, these different cognitive systems, are created out of the structures that are within the brain itself. So it's a new field. It's quite a new field that it's only been around since the 90s is really kind of when neuroscience started, since the 1990s. And it's taking a while to kind of apply because, again, it's obviously something that for the faint of heart, trying to get in and sort of figure out sort of neuroanatomy. Okay. But I mean, a basic understanding is necessary.
So kind of in short, it's kind of how people learn, or how people brains.
Well, it's not just part of the learning, because by looking at these different systems, what we find is that everything is integrated. So learning is affected and part and parcel of these other cognitive systems. If we want to think, I mean, we want to break them down. Not everyone agrees, but certainly there are some basic sort of cognitive systems that people agree on, sort of perception, emotion. Some people would include cognition, consciousness, memory, language as a cognitive system. So there's a whole range and group of these different systems that need to work together, and learning is part of that. Especially if we look at learning as part of behavior, and the only way to actually determine learning is to look at behavior, and by people's actual behavior, then it's all part of this kind of integrated sort of system. And what we've found over the years since the 90s in neuroscience is just the high degree of integration. I mean, the systems that we call them, I mean, that's kind of more just for our own comprehension. They're not necessarily independent systems. And when we look at the brain, they're not housed in nice little parcels inside different parts of the brain. So this whole idea, this phrenology, this pseudoscience idea back in the 1800s, where people talked about this part of your brain does this and this part of your brain handles that. This whole idea of localization, is a vast oversimplification. And the separation is kind of a vast oversimplification that we can actually separate these systems from each other.
Okay. What kind of the traditional learning techniques kind of jar with this new idea of how information is stored?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you're looking at some of this, some of it actually leans back to some more traditional approaches, and then moves beyond that. So if we think, so the idea of rote memorization and repetition and those types of things, I mean, those are ideas that have been around for a long time. Ebbinghaus, for example, with the whole repetition and with verbal learning back in the 1880s. I mean, he didn't know anything about the brain, but he sort of knew or had studied how people remember and how people forget as far as memory goes. And what he studied is as true today as it was back then, that hasn't been refuted. So, I mean, you need a certain amount of drilling is necessary. The more you drill, then the easier something becomes, the more often you do something. So repetition and drilling and these types of things are actually quite important. Mm-hmm. But the modern twist on that is that drilling alone and sort of meaningless drills is not really going to get you very far, because you can lose that just as fast as you can gain it, or even faster, if you don't somehow connect these things together, and if you don't make use of these integrated other systems. That we've moved through stages where everyone has talked about emotion as the big deciding factor, but emotion, again, is just one of these many systems. And emotion is not it affects how we learn, and it's an important aspect of how we learn, but it's not the deciding factor of how we learn and how well we learn something and what we learn. It's really kind of the integration of these different systems, how we perceive and all these things. So in some ways it's a simple idea, but it's also a quite complex idea, sort of the integration of these different sort of cognitive systems as we see them today. So what's interesting is, again, within the field of additional language learning, if we want to break this into sort of SLA approaches and bilingual approaches, and even though the fields are converging, they tend to be quite different. And it's usually the field of bilingualism that sort of looks at these things. And again, aside from the studies they've done on pronunciation, where learning another language does have an effect on how someone pronounces in their L1. So there's been a series of publications that kind of focus on L2 effects on L1. And again, they kind of run the gamut, sort of not just from pronunciation, but certainly with vocabulary. And we're looking at conceptualization and how your conceptualization of the world actually change as a result of bringing in L2 or L3 or whatever conceptualizations, and how you actually change the world, and things like extends to things like problem solving. So things that go beyond language. So if we think about, again, the interconnectedness of language with other sort of cognitive areas, but having another language changes the way you perceive the world. If perception is sort of the ground route in which information comes in, and then Rady has this 4 theaters model or 4 river model, and perception is kind of the basic. It's the basis of all the things that we know come in through perception. Learning a new language obviously changes the way you perceive the world. You notice different things, you perceive different things, and you perceive them in different ways. By doing that, that allows you then to actually think about these things in different ways. So when we get into vocabulary learning and conceptualization and vocabulary learning at one level, if we're thinking about meaning, then conceptualizations are one aspect of meaning. So that becomes, I mean, we have a huge crossover between the different languages, and this is where we see a lot of integration. But as I mentioned, what's been less explored, because from the SLA model has traditionally explored the idea that we have the L1 norm, and then you have these language learners that kind of never achieve this L1 norm. Well, yeah, of course they're not going to achieve the L1 norm because the systems integrate. So a person who knows 2 different languages is not going to write exactly like a fictitious kind of over-idealized L1 monolingual writer, for example. They're going to integrate aspects of the other languages they may know into their writing procedures, and actually the structures that they form, but also how they organize and things like that. It doesn't make them a lesser writer, it just makes them a little bit different. So part of this, again, the challenge is kind of integrating this idea into the mainstream, where we kind of have to eliminate the idea that there's a perfect L1 kind of speaker, or that a monolingual type of use of a language is somehow superior over a sort of multilingual use of a language. What studies have shown, again, from the field of bilingualism, is that the multilingual uses tend to be better, in that bilinguals and multilinguals are better at problem solving than monolinguals, simply because they have this extra range of repertoires that they not only can use, but they do use in the regular interactions. And in the way, in everything they do, I mean, that goes through runs the gamut through the different cognitive systems, from emotion and movement and all these things. I mean, everything changes if you've learned the language well enough, past this kind of threshold level where things get integrated.
Is there any standard? What is that threshold?
Well, it varies. Yeah, I mean, it varies from person to person. I mean, people they describe it often through functional description. So you reach this threshold level depending on how successfully you're able to actually function within that language. So if you have met the minimal standard of sort of being able to function in communicative settings within the target language society, then you've kind of hit that bottom threshold level. That's when you start to see changes that you can notice. But the changes start to occur quickly anywhere. And this is where, again, when we start looking at these things, people learn in different ways, and people will learn different things, and things might become integrated in some areas very quickly, depending on people's interests and the pre-existing structures that are already there within the L1. We may not be able to describe it or view it in a systematic way, but these things are already happening. So there's all sorts of things bubbling below the surface that teachers really never pay any attention to, or they perceive negatively that aren't necessarily negative at all. I mean, we don't like variation in education, right? Variability doesn't matter whether they're talking about language or anything else. Someone comes up with a different answer than you expected, and you may not like that very much. But people will always have a somewhat different answer. That facts are very much subjective, and people will integrate the same fact in a different way into their cognitive architecture. And it's hard to say that one, I mean, in retrospect, I mean, at the moment looking at it, this is right, this is wrong. But when we step back, it's not always easy to see exactly what's right or wrong when we're dealing with things that are presented as facts but aren't necessarily very factual, really.
Okay, so the kind of classroom application then from this perspective.
Well, yeah, the classroom applications, what people generally talk about is engagement and these types of things. So again, when we're interested in learning, which means we're looking then, focusing to a certain extent on memory systems, even though with the understanding that memory is an integrated part of this whole sort of larger network. And we want to use these other aspects to enhance sort of how people are learning within memory. So again, the first thing is using some of this information to help people learn better, make sure that people are ready for learning. So background knowledge is important. If you don't know anything, then it's going to be harder to learn. At the same time, emotion is important, but only having people learn things that are fun is not going to get you very far either. So we need to find different ways to make things meaningful to a range of students. So that means somehow packaging this in ways that will get people to notice what it is that you're actually putting there. And that means knowing your students. And there's no like one technique. I mean, it really is, you have to know your students and know what engages them, get to know them as people. At the same time, when we're assessing, we need to try to use assessments that are not sort of cookie cutter, sort of fit in the box type of assessments. That facts are important, but facts are only there to support larger, bigger ideas. That a whole range of facts, memorizing a whole range of facts, is not very good if you can't make use of those things. So in language, sort of memorizing grammar rules, as we've all sort of experienced as language teachers, having people memorize all these grammar rules, but not knowing how they apply into a larger system is not very useful. At the same time, having a larger system without knowing any of those rules makes it difficult for people to know how to make sense of those things. I mean, those rules help people be in some ways autonomous and understand better and process better what's going on around them. If we're talking about grammar rules at all, yeah, sort of structures would be a better term. So part of that is how we present information, how we engage the students. But as I mentioned, the initial encoding is just the drop in the bucket. It's how we keep students working within this, how we come back to it, how we repeat, how we do, I mean, to not use the term drilling, but how we get students to come back and use this information themselves and use this for larger type tasks. So basically problem solving type tasks, and how we get students to use this information to problem solving so they can integrate it in their own way into their system. But again, this then becomes the question, once, if we're doing this, how do we assess it? Because it kind of goes against the current kind of framework of assessments that we're using now that are all factually based. Right. But extracting those facts, as we well know, extracting those facts does not mean that they know how to do anything with them. And it doesn't mean they're even going to have them 5 minutes later. That it has to be put into a larger system.
Sure. And I guess this gets more difficult the more students you have. If you've got,
well, it depends on how you're teaching. I mean, it really depends on how you're teaching. Getting the students engaged, do you have more students? You just have to break them into groups. I mean, again, it's not about the teacher. I mean, it means that we have to shift to more student-centered. I mean, students don't learn what we teach. They learn what they think about, right? They don't learn what we teach. They learn what they think about. So getting students to think about these things is what the teacher really needs to do. Once they have a few facts that they can manipulate, then they have to start using them and start thinking about them. And that can happen in very unpredictable ways. So I don't think it really matters whether you have 5 people or 205 people. You need to get people to think about these things, and that means having them do something. They have to do stuff on their own. I mean, not just sit there and listen to you talk about these things, because that's a little bit of that is fine, but ultimately that's not going to be very engaging, and they're just going to turn off, and they're not going to notice the systems are going to shut down.
Yes, you mentioned about meaningful usage, but meaningful in this case doesn't mean fun.
No, meaningful doesn't have to be fun. I mean, learning isn't, and thought, we don't always think about fun things, right? We don't spend all day with giant smiles on our faces thinking, wow, that's just fun. I mean, if someone did, we'd think they were a moron, right? That we think about things that are serious, and we think about things that are challenging and difficult. And as a teacher, it's finding the balance between those and variety, getting people to do things in different ways. And work these things in different ways. It's not all fun. So yeah, something that's meaningful is not something that's fun. It basically, I mean, taking the idea from Ausable, it's a very basic idea, but something that they can connect with what they already know. And an emotion works both ways. Negative emotions are also help people learn things. It's not all about positive emotion. And we need to be careful how, if we're directing, kind of, if we think that we're controlling the connections between these things, you don't know how the students are going to how they're going to perceive that, and whether they'll make those same connections.
Anybody that's really interested in the subject, where's the best place to find extra information or read?
Right, and this is sort of the problem with this area at the moment anyway, is that for people that are interested in the subject, I mean, you want to go to the basic neuroscience stuff. The only problem is extrapolating that from what's out there, the neuroscience, and then into language itself. There are publications that focus on brain and language, but very few of them actually focus on the applied side of that, or even the part of language that we're kind of used to, sort of the linguistic side. So a lot of the information can be quite esoteric when we're looking at this. To my knowledge, there's not one sort of definitive publication that is sort of put out sort of brain-based sort of additional language learning. I don't know anything that's kind of synthesized everything like that. So for people that are going out, they're going to have to piece things together. So there are some publications that focus on sort of brain-based learning. And I mean, there's a book from Jensen, Teaching with the Brain in Mind, which again focuses on teaching in general, focuses on kids, not adults, so it doesn't always match what we're doing. Another interesting publication.
How user-friendly is that?
Well, these are very user-friendly.
Really?
These are kind of beginning level things for people to get into. And I guess that's probably where you want to start. And then you might start looking at some of these other things. Okay. There's a few other basic stuff. There's a book that I've liked for a long time, A User's Guide to the Brain, which is a psychiatrist, actually. Okay. And he's looking at sort of disorders and how these disorders sort of occur. And sort of using the idea of neuroscience, modern ideas from neuroscience, trying to figure out how these kind of disorders, and it's sad to think of it in some ways, but as he's describing these disorders, a lot of it ties into when we think about our students having difficulty learning a second language and these types of things. So some of it can be, again, we think, oh, the student is lazy. But that may not be it at all. There are a lot of other issues that tie in there. It could be a problem with perception. They don't have enough background knowledge, so people are pretending that they understand what they're listening to, and they have no idea what they're listening to because they can't even discern phonemes. They don't have enough vocabulary items, and they're kind of stumbling their way through. And you develop ways of, and I think we've all probably had students like this. As you're stumbling through this, you develop techniques for making it look like you're kind of in control, but you're increasingly further and further out. So it's an interesting approach, and it has very little to do with what we're doing, but it all ties in because we're talking about the brain itself. People could go to basic books, like Bannock has a very good book on basic neuroscience where she talks about the different systems and all the different cognitive systems and how they work, a little bit about their basic neurology and how they work. There are books about learning, sort of that try to look at learning in a more modern way. So Klein has an interesting book simply called Learning. It's in its 14th edition. It's in its 14th edition, and there are parts of that that work fairly well, especially when they get into newer things about memory. But bringing all these different things into language can be challenging because these people aren't linguists, and the chapters that they have on language are often not very well informed. So that's another issue. Like, what does this actually mean for language? Because that's another revolution that's not quite happened yet.
All right. So on that note, thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure.
So there you have it. Difficult, I know, but definitely worth knowing. It's a powerful tool in the classroom to know how that little brain inside their skull works. So you can follow me on @MOTcast on Twitter, or just go to my website, mastersoftesol.com. See you next episode.